Conor McGregor just publicly disrespected Nate Diaz on X, calling him a lanky streak of piss after mocking his recent loss. But according to reports, Nate is not taking it lightly. He just attacked Conor, and now the entire situation is getting really ugly. Here's what happened. On May 17th, 2026, Conor McGregor reacted to his longtime rival getting stopped by Mike Perry on social media. The tweet was short and loaded. "I see why Nate Diaz 209 didn't take the fight, lol. Anyway, here's to when I get my hands on you, you lanky streak of piss. Trilogy, and I gonna need my money." The message hit different because of the timing. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for the Notorious to fire shots, as just hours before Dana White officially confirmed McGregor's UFC return against Max Holloway. So, here's McGregor with his own comeback fight locked in, looking across the combat sports landscape and watching his old rival get carved up on Netflix. And instead of saying nothing, instead of waiting, he decided to twist the knife. In his post, McGregor suggested Diaz's performance proved he was wise to avoid a trilogy fight with him. That's the implication, that Diaz didn't want the trilogy because he knew he couldn't hang anymore. That Diaz, the same man who submitted McGregor back in 2016, was now damaged goods. And McGregor said it publicly, tagging Diaz directly with no filter. But to understand why this stung and why Diaz's response matters, you have to go back, way back. Because this isn't about one tweet or one bad night at the Intuit Dome. This is a rivalry that has shaped the UFC for a decade. The history between the two is legendary. Diaz famously submitted McGregor at UFC 196 in March 2016, handing the Irishman his first UFC loss. McGregor won the immediate rematch at UFC 202 that August by majority decision, but a trilogy bout has eluded fans for nearly a decade. One win apiece, tied at 1-1. No closure, no rubber match, just years of talk, social media jabs, career detours, injuries, and promotional politics keeping the third fight from happening. And now in 2026, with both men attempting comebacks, McGregor chose to reignite the flame by mocking Diaz hours after he'd been bloodied in the cage. McGregor has not fought since he broke his leg in the trilogy bout against Dustin Poirier at UFC 264 in July 2021. And at 37, he is trying to time his return carefully. After multiple delays and public back and forth over opponents, 5 years away from the octagon, half a decade on the sidelines. And yet the first thing McGregor does when the spotlight swings back to fighting is take a shot at the man from Stockton. The reason is obvious. Diaz is the one name McGregor has never been able to fully put behind him. Every other rival, Jose Aldo, Eddie Alvarez, Dustin Poirier, McGregor either knocked out cold or the story ran its course. But Diaz remains the one who got away. The one fight that's still 1-1. The one score that has never been settled. And that eats at a man like McGregor who built his entire brand on finishing what he starts and doing so in style. So when Diaz showed up on Netflix to fight Mike Perry and things went sideways, McGregor saw an opening. Not an opening in the cage, but an opening in the narrative. A chance to rewrite the story before the third chapter even begins. A chance to make Diaz look small, washed, and afraid. All in 280 characters or less. But there's a problem with that version of events. And it starts with what Diaz actually said before the fight even happened. Before Diaz ever stepped into the cage against Mike Perry, he told the world exactly why he wasn't fighting Conor McGregor. And it wasn't because he was scared or because he couldn't compete. It was principle. Nate Diaz has never been shy about saying no. And ahead of his Mike Perry fight under the MVP banner on Netflix, he explained why he turned down the chance to be Conor McGregor's comeback opponent in the UFC. Speaking to Ariel Helwani in Fight Week Media, Diaz said the promotion wanted to plug him straight back into its plans for McGregor's long-discussed return, but the matchup did not appeal on those terms. The quote was direct and characteristically blunt. "I know that the UFC wanted the Conor fight right now, and I'm not trying to be a comeback story for Conor." That sentence alone reshapes the entire narrative McGregor tried to create with his tweet. McGregor framed it as Diaz ducking the fight. Diaz framed it as refusing to be used as a prop. Within that context, his refusal to serve as McGregor's launch pad fits the long-running dynamic between the two. Diaz still wants a third fight, but on terms where McGregor has already proved himself against others first. So their trilogy feels like a clash between two active winning names rather than a tune-up for a star coming off a layoff. That's a significant distinction. Diaz was not saying he didn't want to fight McGregor ever again. He was saying he didn't want to be the first name on McGregor's return card. The guy brought in to make McGregor look good after 5 years of inactivity. Diaz wanted McGregor to come back, fight someone, prove he still had it, and then they could settle the score for real. Speaking to MMA Fighting, Diaz, 41, made it clear he wanted the current BMF champion for his UFC return fight rather than a Conor McGregor trilogy. He had his sights set on Charles Oliveira for a return inside the octagon. He wanted to fight Charles Oliveira instead, but Oliveira refused his offer. Now, ahead of his bout with Perry, the 41-year-old Stockton native criticized Oliveira. He called out the BMF champion for turning down their matchup, while simultaneously trying to book a fight against the Irishman. The irony was rich, and Diaz wasn't about to let it slide. Oliveira said no to Diaz, but then turned around and called out McGregor. The man Diaz was also refusing to fight because he considered McGregor diminished by his layoff. In Diaz's eyes, Oliveira was chasing the same easy payday he had turned down. Diaz said, "You're right there," and then he won one fight, and then he called out Conor. That's exactly what I thought when he called out Conor. Why are you trying to fight the guy who's coming off a leg break, just got knocked out, and he's all messed up and on a downward spiral? That's the Nate Diaz worldview in a nutshell. He operates on a code, one rooted in the Stockton fight scene, where his brother Nick Diaz helped shape his approach to the sport. You fight real fighters. You don't cherry-pick opponents. You don't use someone else's comeback as your stepping stone. And if you turn down a fight with Nate Diaz, you don't get to then chase the same guy Nate also refused. Diaz is focused on his bout against Perry. As he said, his goal is to fight real fighters only. "I'm not fighting anybody who's not a real fighter anymore because it's devaluing," Diaz said. "You take the loss. A decision loss. Boring. Waste of your time." So Diaz chose Mike Perry, a genuine, violent, credentialed fighter. Coming off a successful run in bare-knuckle fighting, Perry had revisited MMA after 5 years of absence. During his time away, Perry concentrated his efforts on an unbeaten career in the bare-knuckle boxing ring and a one-off return to professional boxing against Jake Paul in 2024. That wasn't a soft touch. That was a man who had spent half a decade training to take punishment and deliver it without gloves. Diaz picked the harder fight on purpose because that's who he is. And that decision is exactly what McGregor used against him after it went wrong. The stage was set for what was supposed to be one of the most electric fight cards of 2026. The long-standing rivalry between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz was reignited as McGregor reacted to Diaz's brutal TKO loss to Mike Perry on the undercard of Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano on Netflix, presented by Jake Paul's MVP MMA. The Irishman's former rival, Nate Diaz, returned to MMA for the first time in almost 4 years at the upcoming MVP MMA event on Netflix. Before Ronda Rousey made her comeback against Gina Carano in the main event, Diaz battled Mike Perry at the Intuit Dome in Englewood, California. The atmosphere inside the Intuit Dome was electric. The card represented a seismic moment in combat sports. The first ever MMA card broadcast on Netflix, headlined by Ronda Rousey's return to fighting against Gina Carano with Francis Ngannou, also on the bill. And in the co-main event slot sat Nate Diaz, the man from Stockton who hadn't worn 4-ounce gloves since submitting Tony Ferguson in September 2022. Nate Diaz's return to MMA was a gruesome affair. Facing fellow UFC veteran Mike Perry, Diaz was battered and bloodied over 2 rounds. The relentless punishment forced Diaz's corner to throw in the towel before the 3rd round could begin. From the opening bell, this fight was a collision of styles and wills. Perry opened the fight with major aggression, swinging looping shots at his taller foe. Diaz stuck the jab and looked to clinch up to avoid Perry's wild swings. In the early exchanges, Diaz appeared to be the more composed fighter, working behind his trademark jab and using his reach advantage to keep Perry at distance. Early on, Diaz worked his jab, and the pair clinched up moments later, with Perry landing first one elbow, then another. Diaz appeared to be briefly overwhelmed, then landed a throw. But it was in the clinch where Perry did the most devastating work. Those elbows, sharpened by years of bare-knuckle wars where everything is exposed and every strike lands on bone, sliced Diaz open. The cuts opened early, and they bled freely. Who cut Diaz's face open in several places, leading to a fight that looked more like a crimson-laden crime scene. By the second round, the damage was catastrophic. Nate Diaz was covered in blood and cuts after a 2-round war with Mike Perry. Before the third round, Diaz's corner decided their fighter was in no fit state to continue competing, so they threw in the towel. In the end, the corner stopped the fight. Diaz could not see anything with so much blood pouring into his eyes. The blood was blinding him. Every time Diaz blinked, red washed over his vision. The cuts above his eyes across his forehead turned his own face into the enemy. His corner, the people who love him and have trained with him for decades, made the call that fighters hate to hear, but sometimes need. The towel went in. The fight was over. Nate Diaz put on 4-ounce gloves for the first time in nearly 4 years to face Mike Perry, who earned a second-round TKO due to a doctor stoppage after Perry opened a cut on Diaz's head. But even in defeat, Diaz was defiant. Immediately after the stoppage, he made his intentions clear. Moments later, Perry agreed to run it back with Nate Diaz, who used his post-fight interview to request a rematch. "I think I broke my finger in the first 2 seconds," Diaz said. "I was spending too much time worrying about that rather than focusing on the animal at hand. I'm going to come back and get his ass. Come on, ain't nobody beating me twice." That's Nate Diaz in the rawest, most distilled form imaginable. Covered in his own blood, face carved open by a man who fights without gloves for a living, and his first words are about coming back for more. Not excuses, not retirement talk, just a promise wrapped in profanity. Ain't nobody beating me twice. It was into this scene, this moment of raw, bloodied resilience, that Conor McGregor decided to insert himself with a tweet. On May 17th, 2026, Conor McGregor reacted to his longtime rival getting stopped by Mike Perry on social media. The tweet was short and loaded. "I see why Nate Diaz 209 didn't take the fight. LOL. Anyway, here's to when I get my hands on you. You lanky streak of piss. Trilogy, and I'm going to need my money." What makes McGregor's shot at Diaz even more pointed is what was happening simultaneously on the other side of the combat sports world. Over in the UFC, just before Diaz and Perry fought, UFC President Dana White announced that McGregor is making his own comeback to MMA after 5 years away, when he battles Max Holloway in a rematch at UFC 329 in July. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Conor McGregor will return from his 5-year spell away from MMA on July 11th. Dana White announced the Irishman will headline UFC 329 during Francis Ngannou's win over Felipe Lima. McGregor will face Max Holloway in a 5-round welterweight main event at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. It'll be the second time they've fought. McGregor famously scored a unanimous decision when, despite suffering a torn ACL during their featherweight fight with Holloway in 2013, 13 years between the first fight and the second. McGregor won that original contest when both men were featherweight prospects before either had held a UFC title, before either had become a household name. Now they would meet again as welterweights, as legends, as men with everything to prove and nothing left to lose. This marks McGregor's first fight since breaking his leg against Dustin Poirier during their trilogy fight in 2021. 5 years without competing in MMA, 5 years of speculation, of social media antics, of whiskey promotion and yacht photos, and constant, will he or won't he headlines that consumed the combat sports media cycle month after month. And now finally there was a date, an opponent, and a venue. And McGregor chose to celebrate that announcement not by focusing on Holloway, not by talking about the weight class or the game plan or the layoff rust, but by going after Nate Diaz. With McGregor locked in for July 11th, The Irishman is already trying to build a secondary narrative for a Diaz trilogy. That's the play. Even while preparing for one of the most dangerous fights of his career against a man in Max Holloway, who has only gotten better with age, McGregor can't help but keep one eye fixed on Stockton, on the unfinished business, on the man who choked him unconscious on the biggest stage in the sport and then told the world he wasn't surprised. As Diaz bled in the Netflix cage, Dana White confirmed McGregor's official comeback. Think about the optics of that for a moment. On one screen, Diaz is getting cut open by Mike Perry. On another, Dana White is telling the world that McGregor is back. Two timelines colliding. One man's worst night overlapping with another man's triumphant return to relevance. And then McGregor ties the two narratives together with a single surgical tweet. The message was layered. On the surface, mockery. Underneath, a pitch for the trilogy fight complete with the hashtag trilogy and I'm going to need my money. McGregor wasn't just making fun of Diaz. He was positioning himself for the next big payday. If he beats Holloway at UFC 329, the loudest call will be for Diaz McGregor 3. And by mocking Diaz now, by establishing himself as the dominant voice in the rivalry, McGregor is already negotiating from a position of perceived strength. But Diaz, characteristically, didn't fold under the weight of all this. Despite the blood, despite the loss, and despite McGregor's calculated mockery, Nate Diaz walked straight from the cage to the media room and faced the press. He didn't hide. He didn't duck questions. He stood there, stitches holding his face together, and gave his take on everything. Despite his own brutal loss, Diaz faced the media immediately after his fight and was asked about the McGregor versus Holloway announcement. Nate Diaz reacted calmly to the news of Conor McGregor's return, saying the rematch with Max Holloway should have happened a long time ago. Diaz spoke to the media after MVP MMA won on Saturday night, where he lost to Mike Perry. He was asked about Dana White's announcement of McGregor versus Holloway 2 at UFC 329, made during the Netflix event. His reaction was measured and shrewd. It's a rematch, right? Because Conor was taking him down the last time. So, that's going to be a good fight, Diaz said. When pressed for a winner, Diaz refused to predict the outcome of the July showdown. No trash talk, no bitterness, no panic about his own loss or McGregor's incoming tweet, just a calm assessment of the landscape. Whoever is put in front of him says what he thinks without a PR team filtering the words, and never, not once in his career, has pretended to be anything other than what he is, a fighter from Stockton who learned to scrap on the streets before he ever stepped into a professional gym. Prior to his fight against Perry, Diaz also made it known that he wants to run it back with McGregor before his career is over. That desire hasn't changed. Not after the Perry loss, not after McGregor's tweet. Diaz still wants that third fight. The question is whether the landscape of combat sports will allow it to happen, and on whose terms. However, Diaz's TKO loss to Perry leave questions about his fighting future. And that's where the conversation gets complex. At 41 years old, coming off a loss where his face was opened up so severely that his corner had to stop the fight, what does the path forward look like for Nate Diaz? Can he realistically compete with a motivated McGregor who has presumably spent 5 years healing, training, and preparing for one more run at glory? With Diaz losing to Perry at MVP MMA, the chances of a McGregor trilogy bout now seem slim. Though, if he could defeat Perry in a rematch, perhaps McGregor would once again be interested. The trilogy isn't dead, but it's on life support. McGregor used his tweet to simultaneously mock Diaz and keep the door open for a fight he knows would generate enormous revenue. The hashtag trilogy and I'm going to need my money wasn't a throwaway line.